On the Season 5 finale of Momentum, a Race Forward podcast, Deputy Senior Vice President of Programs, Nikko Viquiera, sits with internationally acclaimed poet, comedian, public speaker, and actor, ALOK Vaid-Menon. This conversation was recorded this past November at Race Forward's Just Narratives for Multiracial Solidarity 2025. In this conversation, Nikko and ALOK explore how storytelling shapes the way we understand identity, power, and possibility, challenging the dominant narratives that have long defined who gets to belong. Together, they examine what it means to move beyond narratives rooted only in struggle and instead imagine a future where liberation includes pleasure, safety, and the freedom to fully exist. Here's their conversation.
Hello, ALOK. Thank you so much for being with us. As an official representative of Race Forward, we're deeply, deeply honored to have you in our space and part of our work. On a personal note, as someone who is also non-binary and has gone through my own journey with gender and gender binary, seeing your work, experiencing you as a human, and your very presence has just been so beautiful and inspiring. And I'm honored to be sitting down and talking with you today. So thank you for being here.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
In your work, especially as a stand-up, as a comedian, as a performer, in your art, you make so many people laugh, which truly is very much needed in this moment when laughter is so hard to come by. And so I'm curious, what's making you laugh? What's giving you joy in this moment?
So one of the best parts about being on tour is I get to meet local comedians everywhere I go. So I'm coming to you, I just came off of my Latin American tour, and I had all of these amazing Spanish language comedians, and I understood about 10% of what they were saying, and I was still laughing the full time. And that was a really great reminder to me that it's often not about what we're saying, it's about the energy that we're conjuring. And so much of what being a comedian is like kind of being a lightning rod for laughter, like allowing it to pass through you so then it can pass through the crowd to sort of channel that humor as a force. So I'm laughing because of the amazing work of comedians all over the world.
Race Forward does a lot of work on narrative strategy, narrative power. We truly believe that narrative power is necessary in transforming the world, changing systems, changing hearts. In your work, I've seen, even as myself, experience a lot of the way you shift narratives through your art, through your person, from your own words. What narratives are you trying to change or center in the work that you do?
You know, I think in the beginning of my work, I was really appalled at how people like you and me had been erased from the storytelling of our cultures. I felt a deep sense of grief that it took me being in my 20s to learn about how various practices of colonization had disappeared, criminalized, and invisibilized people like me, such that I grew up thinking that who I was was an impossibility. And so a narrative that I was really interested in advancing is that we have always been here. And I think that narrative is still really important, this idea that we belong to always, and that people like me have kissed this earth and will always be here. But then I moved my energy away, because what I realized is that so much of what was being asked of me was to try to decorate or embellish a pre-existing story rather than exist in my own orbit. I always had to be combating something, relating to something. Even the language that we're given, non-binary, already creates a struggle and defines me against something that I don't even think exists. I don't believe that the binary is true, so how can I cross it? Immigrant rights activists have taught us we didn't cross the border crossed us, and the same applies to trans thinking. We didn't cross the binary crossed us. It superimposed us. So as I began to untether my narrative from one of resistance to living in its own light, a more purposeful, aligned narrative began to emerge, and that was that joy is our birthright, and that play and silliness are fundamental to being alive. And those didn't really compute with the ways that I had been trained as a thinker and as an organizer, is that often I was taught that those things were superficial, incidental, not necessary, that struggle was the real location of due diligence when it came to politics. And then I started to think about this word playbook. We're always talking about what are the playbooks for our movements, and we focus more on the books than we do on the play. And I started to realize, actually, in a state of play, I am the freest version of myself. In a state of play, I'm less concerned about what other people think about me, and I'm more concerned with my own aliveness, where my inklings are taking, where my hunches are leading me. And as I began to watch more improv and do more improv, I was like, wow, this is the closest I've come to freedom, is without anticipating a reaction, just following a hunch and being it and committing to that bit fully and wholeheartedly. And I began to realize that actually every system in the world that is oppressive is a system that's predicated off of the lie that we must suffer in order to access joy. That joy is something we can only get when we pay our coupons of suffering, that we have to work until we retire, that we have to struggle until we die. And joy is always held up to us as something that we have to wait for. And I was like, that sounds like a scam to me, actually. Like, that's not a given. Why can't I have it now? And when I began to say that joy is our birthright now, I began to really shift the way that I was spending my time, getting my priorities less straight and more queer. And what getting my priorities queer allowed me to realize is, like, it's not just that I'm fighting for the end of discrimination, the acceptance and integration of people like me. I'm fighting for ease. I'm fighting for pleasure. I'm fighting for the ability to chill. I'm fighting for the ability to relax. I'm fighting for the ability to have a good time. And those things can't feel ephemeral. They have to feel foundational.
So many threads to pull. One of the things I love how you thread the gender binary, and that we've always been here, we've always existed with colonialism. Our work is deeply connected to gender, to health. From your perspective, why do we need to all care about the gender binary, right? In what ways will gender binary continue to derail the progress of the work of folks in the racial justice space, in social justice, progressive spaces?
So often there's a misunderstanding that the gender binary just negatively impacts non-binary people, and that when non-binary people indict the gender binary, we're being self-interested or just appealing to a minoritarian issue. But I actually believe that the gender binary is a system of oppression that harms all people, regardless of their gender, and I'd love to explain why. The gender binary is the choice to divide billions of complex souls into one of two categories, man and woman, and to frame those categories as oppositional. So to be a man means not to be a woman, and to be a woman means not to be a man. And then that's graphed into every element of our experience as human beings: emotions, colors, fashion, apparel, beauty, all become gendered, and masculinity and femininity are constantly framed as the only options and as oppositional. So that means each one of us are born into a world that saturates us with these predetermined meanings of what it means to be a man or a woman, that frames us with antagonism and conflict as our first social and cultural currency. So rather than creativity, self-expression, wonder, possibility, what we're framed in is antagonism. I remember before I had any language of gender, I had this deep desire to dance. And I used to dance all the time. And then people told me, oh, that's feminine. So there's this way in which gender enters in as an impediment and an obstacle to my self-creation. So what if it's feminine, one? And two, why are we gendering movement? That kind of makes no sense. And so all of us actually have grief from being told who we should be and not asked who we actually are. It's just that trans and non-binary people have thus far been most precise at articulating a kind of grief that all people are facing. And what happens is that many people walk around mistaking their wounds as mouths. They don't know that their personalities are forged within the context of pain, because this entire project of assimilating all of our beauty into these binaries is done masqueraded as love. So it's often the first architects of the gender binary are the people who say that they love us, and that the reason they're doing this to us is because they love us. I remember when I was younger and I would display this traditionally feminine behavior, people who loved me would tell me, if you look like that, then you're going to draw scrutiny and harm. You have to act a certain way. But in trying to protect me from harm, they were actually causing me harm, right? So what happens is many of us don't question this entire superstructure because it is so naturalized and normalized that it begins to present like reality. So when we critique the gender binary, a lot of people think about this as like, you're telling me that the sky is green. It goes contrary to everything that they feel like this world order is set up on, which is why I think it's become such a pressure point. The reason that trans and non-binary people have become so scapegoated is because within our knowledges is a portal to a fundamentally different worldview, a worldview that treasures and affirms self-determination over being pre-slotted into fixed categories. And the reason that racial justice movements need to learn about these histories and contemporary practices of the gender binary is because the gender binary's world order is a colonial world order. It's a world order that's rooted in dispossession, that's rooted in exploitation, that's rooted in conflict, and rooted in everything that we're fighting against. And yet, so often, those of us who try to continue racial justice thought into the trans space are seen as kind of betraying a fundamental contract of racial justice, rather than actually gifting and enriching a construct of racial justice to dream even bigger and imagine even further. So much of what we've been sold, what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman, is defined within Eurocentric white cultural paradigms. And those are actually disenfranchising all Black and brown people who are held up to standards of gender that are not just social and cultural, they are racial and they are colonial. And so by creating the space for more expansive definitions of what it means to be a man or a woman, we're creating more space for all Black and brown people and Indigenous people to breathe into their fullest expression of themselves.
It's such a strong example of what genuine solidarity can do, what happens when we actually are in right relationship with each other across movements, across issue areas, and what we can learn from each other. Because I think sometimes when we think of solidarity, it's about, yes, it's about resources. Yes, it's about sharing material things. But I think the thing you said about being able to learn, and that's why wedge issues like trans people being used as wedges in this moment is a strategy and not by accident, because there is a world that opens up if we were to learn from non-binary and trans and queer people about that everything is a scam. Everything is made up to imprison us with these invisible walls.
Right. If we're saying that these ideas of gender that you thought were unimpeachable were actually made up, then what else is made up? If we're saying that only you have the right to self-determine your own gender, then what else are you able to self-determine? So what gender is an incursion from the state and from systems of power that determine who we should be. That's a vector of power. And so we're interrogating what we thought, what many people thought was not a struggle of power as a struggle of power, which opens up a larger critique and analysis of what are the ways in which we've given up our self-determination and our power. And so essentially what's happening is that the backlash to trans people is a cohort of people who are fighting for the right to remain unfree. They're fighting for the right to remain ideologically, intellectually, spiritually, and emotionally separated from the complexity of the world. And I can have sympathy and compassion for that, because when I began to realize, oh wait, all of this was made up, that was also really ominous and scary for me. Well, then who am I? Is this organic to me, or is this actually a trauma response? What is real? But then I really began to connect with elders, and I think this also is related to the conversation of why trans justice is racial justice, is that despite attempted eradication, despite an attempt to disappear all Indigenous knowledges of gender, that wasn't able to happen. And so we still have evidence of our elders who teach a different way forward. And as I began to meet different elders who reminded me that there had always been people like me and that we held fundamental and integral roles to our community, I actually saw myself as part of an unbroken chain. And I found a lot of that fear and that anguish was healed by being part of intergenerational community. So whenever I'm hearing people feel a sense of panic and anxiety and skittishness, what do you mean? What does it mean to be a man or woman? I'm like, oh, it's really time to bring people together in the same room. Because when you meet people who live lives that you thought were impossible, something happens.
As you're speaking, one of the things that stand out to me is how you're able to, and even in reading your book, like I've read your book like 3 or 4 times already, you're able to somehow thread and bridge trauma or difficult moments from your life with, yes, healing, but also with insight and generative ideas and strategy and joy, right? Like you talk about play, what happens when you focus on the play part of the playbook. And in our work, artists or organizers or leaders of color are in this work because of trauma, because of the trauma that we've experienced from violent systems. And so we're here because we want to dismantle those systems that have harmed us in the past. And yet a lot of us get stuck on the trauma, the harms, even in our work. And yet somehow you've been beautifully able to get to the point of joy and strategy without leaving the trauma behind and somehow seamlessly connecting them. And so curious for people, especially people of color in the social justice spaces who carry that trauma and yet have to deal with the exact same violent systems, what would you tell them in still continuing to do this work to fight for liberation and freedom?
Mm-hmm. There's a mistaken idea that joy is escapist, that it's about removing from the world or trying to cope from the world. But I actually think joy is what allows me to sink in to the muck with my eyes open. Joy makes me confront how brutal and awful the world is, unflinchingly and without dissociation, because I know the world that I'm fighting for. So many of us are fluent in what is wrong, but not what is right, and what our proactive vision of what we're trying to actualize is. And I think we have to keep close to our chest the kind of sensibility and feeling that we want to be diffused in the world, let alone as a tactical strategy. You're not going to win over people if your entire mode of engagement is despair. That doesn't work. What works is when you offer people possibility and hope as concrete structures. And they're available to us when we begin to notice beauty, becoming, and winning. So my path toward joy was because I realized that fear was the most biased editor that was filtering through a prism in my life, catastrophe, preaching calamity. But when I moved fear as just one editor and began to look at another, yeah, my life was really hard. And alongside it, there was so much tenderness and friendship and wonder and possibility. Why doesn't that get airtime? Often that doesn't get airtime because it challenges a pre-existent schema that requires me to be a victim. That people look at a life like mine as inherently miserable because that's how the gender binary works. If you transgress these gender norms, then you will suffer and you will be miserable. And so they, in some ways, profit from circulating narratives of trans tragedy because that cements this idea that if you just play it safe and pretend to be a good boy or a good girl, then you'll be okay. But the existence of trans joy invalidates that entire structure that says it's actually not that bad. Certainly there was a lot of pain. Certainly there's a lot of loss. But in my life, that loss created space for the people that I needed to meet all along. And then I think the next piece is I began to realize that the reason I was so thoroughly hunted was because people perceived the stench of my joy even before I could. It was actually envy. All transphobia, homophobia, racism, prejudice is psychologically, the psychological function of hatred is envy. Because what happens is people are deeply jealous of the ways we've come to accept ourselves, the ways we've come to dress and dance and love and build community and connect and find possibility and bloom gardens in their wounds. And instead of saying, hey, can you show me how you did that? It's easier to try to eliminate us, because then when you eliminate us, you don't have to confront a glimpse of who you could be. So what I began to realize is that actually the people who were trying to oppress me perceived my own power, my own magnificence more than I did. That was a problem. And so I began to do the work of trying to develop a self-concept unmediated by the way that this society has imprinted my life. And when I developed that self-concept, all I felt was gratitude and joy. I feel so grateful that I'm so lucky to be trans, and so grateful and so lucky to be in this form. And that took a lot of work and a lot of grief work of parting with versions of my life that I thought would be safer and more secure if I was something else. But then I realized safety without authenticity is not something I'm interested in. There are real losses and casualties to living an authentic life, but there are also real gains and real victories. And one of those gains and victories is to be able to feel my laughter as a tremor akin to an earthquake, something that shakes me and moves me and reassembles me into a bigger person.
So much gratitude hearing you say that. Gender binary thinking is really about control on many levels. And when you talk about breaking the gender binary as joy, it speaks to me as liberation. It speaks to me as, oh, this is what freedom, this is what liberation from harmful systems look like. And the other thing that you said was around even the language that we use to talk about non-binary people, right? Like it's still in reference to the binary, as if, who is being centered in that language and who is still at the margins, because why can't I just be myself? Like, why do I have to be non-something? And that's such a real thing in progressive spaces. There's been a lot of critique and conversations around language, even though the desire is to really center those most impacted by systems. And so for organizations working on centering the leadership, the experiences, the humanity of trans, non-binary, and queer people, how do we do it in a way that doesn't actually do more harm or advance the harmful narratives that we are trying to dismantle?
Well, first I want to say I have a lot of grace for the ways in which oppressive paradigms creep into our own psyche. It makes a lot of sense. We're of the world that we're trying to undo. So I have grace for that complicated, messy, thorny process of trying to excavate meaning outside of what we've been primed into. But I would extend that to even this idea of most impacted. This is a framework that has become really colloquial within a lot of progressive spaces, but it's in turn a framework that presets trans life as only having worthiness in proximity to violence and violation. So as if our leadership and our need to be listened to is only approximate to our suffering, which then creates a perverse incentive for us not to heal and not to be free, because then there's a worry of, will I still be noticed if I'm no longer precarious? And there's a way in which we continue to fetishize at the altar of precarity and uplift suffering as a metric of worthiness, which I think is not the kind of world that we want. I want people to not be able to suffer and still be listened to and heard. Is there a way that we can create a world where trans people are noticed, regarded, seen as wonderful as we are, without us having to be filtered through this prism of suffering? Because I think then what rehashes is a kind of sense of a paternalism, like we need someone else to pedestalize us, when in fact we've been doing this work since the beginning of time. What we need is for other people to believe that they are worthy of freedom. And if they believe that they're worthy of freedom, listening to the contributions of trans people becomes imperative. So I try to move it away from like, accept me, to accept yourself. If you really accepted the full range of your humanity, you would understand that attacks on trans people are also an attack on you, because they're restricting the possible options that you have in your own life. And what the trans movement is fighting for is for your right to be a man or a woman as well, not just for trans people. We're fighting for gender self-determination, which is an ethic that all people should be behind. So rather than focusing on identity, I try to focus on the politics and the ethics. So rather than accept me as a trans person, it's accept that you are worthy of self-determination too. And this is an inflection point that often gets ignored.
I love the call to vulnerability. One of the harms that we don't talk a lot about in with systems is the inability to be vulnerable with each other, like to be able to dwell with comfort on the unknown, on the what's not here, what I don't know. There's a lot happening in the world. Authoritarianism, fascism is all real, and we work with a lot of artists, narrative practitioners, storytellers. What would you say to fellow artists of color, queer artists working in this space and in this moment? What would you say to them?
I would say now is our time, because the pre-existent strategies did not work. And I think we really have to grieve that. The policy-driven, court-obsessed, legalistic, non-profitized understanding of justice did not work. It made us feel good about ourselves, but it wasn't actually effective. And part of the reason it wasn't effective was because it used, ironically, a very colonial idea of humanity. Rational, deterministic, empirical. Those strategies are not native to who we are. In fact, strategies like dance are actually political vocabularies that have always been there. What can happen, I was just in Brazil and I had the opportunity to be in some samba lines in Salvador, and that was more meaningful to me than most political educations I've been to, because there was an opening there of queer and trans bodies being integrated into a space without allyship, without language, just through vibes and frequency. And that moved me so much because it reminded me that we have so many strategies we've underutilized as movement strategies. And we continue to say, you know, culture workers are important, but yet we have very little infrastructure that supports artists who are really thinking about how to change the world. If you're an artist trying to change the world, they're like, oh, good luck. Rather than, hey, come to us, let's actually think about how to scale this. And the reason I think artists are really needed right now is because we need to reach at a deeper level than intellect. We need to reach people's hearts, minds, and souls. And what art allows us to do is to peek into one another's souls. What I love about laughter so much is that we're so guarded, our defenses are so high, but when we laugh, there's an opening that happens. It's kind of like a kinetic energy that's shared between strangers, and you see someone else laughing, and instinctually, some neurons in your body fire up, and you're laughing too, and there's a moment of opening in a world that often feels constricted. And I could explain why that's political, or you can feel it. Feel what it's like to laugh in a crowd of people and the kind of solidarity and connection that you have afterwards. It's at a deeper level than allyship.
A couple of things are coming up for me as you were saying that, because we just had our conference on a narrative and we had plenaries, we have brilliant people speaking, but there was one moment of true joy when we had performers and they were like, let's go down the stage and dance with the audience. And we just had circles of people dancing and we didn't plan for it. And it was, if I think about what does a solidarity look like in practice, that moment comes to mind. And no one was talking about jargon or solidarity or narrative, but it was such a real practice that happened because of the artists in the room. And I think the other thing that, as you were talking about infrastructure, a lot of the times in progressive spaces, we're so focused on what the opposition is doing that we tend to model the way we think about infrastructure and change. What happens then is that we start copying it instead of thinking about something different, something that hasn't been tested or tried before. And I think that's where the artists come from, because they're the ones that have the most like expansive imaginations and views of the world, and they're the experimenters in the movement.
But I'd build off what you're saying to even say, I don't see an opposition. I am opposed to hatred, inequality, oppression, and violence. I'm not opposed to people. And my humanity-centered vision of the world includes my so-called oppressors, because I know that a world without the tyranny of the gender binary will also help them. I feel profound grief that they think that I'm causing Western civilization's decline and not climate apocalypse, because their intellectual and ideological beliefs are not going to protect them from wildfires or earthquakes or tsunamis or hurricanes. And that pace of which is going to be approximate to all of our doors very, very soon. So the urgency with which I love is paying attention to that, is realizing that these people are not bad people. They're people who have been misled by deliberate strategies that are meant to keep them in an oppositional space. And that's a revelation that I can only come through art, right? A lot of people always say to me, why do you choose compassion when the other side is not? Or why do you choose tenderness or care when the world is so cruel? That doesn't make any sense. And I'm like, okay, you're operating from a worldview that's not the worldview I'm operating from. In my art, my worldview is I'm going to be the world that I want to create. I'm not going to wait for it. I'm not going to 5-year plan it, 10-year plan it. I'm not going to 50 years out think. I'm going to be it now. And the world that I'm in right now is that I need everyone. Because when I am making art, I need everything. Every thought, every experience, every person I've ever met. I keep a very detailed journal of every single thing that I do think and feel, because every single thing that I notice makes it back into the art. And so too is the world. No art is accomplished individually. It's always communal. And so too is the world.
I took notes when I was reading your book. One of the things that really stood out to me, there was the scene from when you were young and you realized you were non-binary. And in the scene, you sat down with a couple of your friends and you told them that you knew in your heart of hearts that you were not a man nor a woman and that you were non-binary. And, you know, your friend said that you could lose a lot, but you never have to worry about losing them. And I honestly teared up reading that. And you said in the book, you realize that becoming ourselves is a collective journey. This to me is such a beautiful way to describe solidarity, allyship. What does it mean to show up to people? What does it mean to care, to love, to hope? And so at the time when we're being pit against each other, right, by design, by strategy, like you said, we really feel that solidarity is important. And so the idea that our freedoms are connected, everyone is impacted by in the same way by the same systems. And so as a way to close this conversation and thinking about solidarity and in the way that you bring people into that solidarity space, what would you advise to people working on solidarity and building the bigger we or the bigger tent to bring in people?
One of the greatest obstacles to change is our maintenance and the myth of separation. In order for the binary to exist, it has to be undergirded by the idea of separation, that you and I are not the same. And in fact, the way that I approach the world is that we're all extensions of one another. So what is impacting you is going to impact me and is impacting me right now, which means that the reason that I show up for you is not out of charity, is not out of pity, but out of mutual enmeshment, that we're all part of this world. And if anyone is suffering, then a piece of me is suffering too. So I don't see it as currying favor or advancing my politic or becoming more intersectional. I see it as being honest to the terms of engagement of the world. The world does not differentiate. We do. Our societies and our cultures have created distinctions between races and class and genders and species and taught us as if our humanity is synonymous with our ability to be categorized. That's not what the world does. The world understands that every ecosystem is profoundly and indelibly interconnected. And that's a worldview that is held by many indigenous people across the world, who are protecting the earth, not out of a separation of the earth from people, but out of a realization that we are the earth and the earth is us. And so for me, when I began this work of challenging how separation shows up, I know that my freedom is inextricably linked to the freedom of the issues that I don't think impact me. So whenever I find out about a crisis, my thought is not, how do I relate this to me? How do I connect this to the struggle for trans rights? No, it doesn't need to be connected to me. If anyone is suffering, I'm there. If there's pain anywhere, I'm there. Because I know that an unblemished life, a freedom that is blemished by other people's pain is not actually a freedom for me. It has to be total and fundamental. So this question, I think, is how do we learn how to care about other people is, I think, a deeper question. And for me, the way that I found that is I really spent a lot of time putting love out to the people who are trying to end me. And that became part of my healing strategies. The amount of street violence, harassment, online harassment that I experience is so extreme that if I was to really feel the fullest extent of the grief and pain from everyone, I wouldn't be able to show up and do in the world. So I started to try something different. Rather than feeling angry and embroiled into a back and forth with people, I just started to say, I love you, and I see what happened. And what would always happen is a softening in me and a softening in them. And then I'd be able to look at that person as a thought that I've had in my life. Oh, I've said that exact same thing to me. I believe that I was not worthy of love and expansion. I believe that I should be eradicated. How did I heal from that? I had someone love me. And in my case, it was elder trans people who were ready to love me before I was ready to love me, who saw me in my self-hatred and were like, oh, I've seen that before. I believe in you. And they loved me out of my shame. We can't shame people out of shame. And so because I've been shown such incredible, inclusive, total earth-shattering love, I have so much love to give. And people discuss love as if it's a finite resource, right? But what I found is that if I give love, I have more love to give, and I have more love to give. And so I think it's about really recognizing that the way forward is love is the antidote to the crisis of separation. And the way that we emancipate ourselves from binary thinking is we love ourselves. And loving ourselves is a deeply political and troubling act, because every system is predicated off of us being alienated from ourselves, hating ourselves, so that they can fill the gap between who we are and our self-concept with their fear and propaganda. But if there is no gap, if we're living a life that is aligned and purposeful, it doesn't stick. And what sticks is community.
Thank you. That is such a beautiful way to end this conversation. I feel deeply transformed just this few minutes we've been together, and I'm so excited for the Race Forward and the Momentum audience to hear everything that they've shared with me today.
Thank you again to ALOK for being our guest for the Season 5 finale of Momentum, a Race Forward podcast. If you want to be in similarly powerful conversations around racial justice and all of its intersections, your next opportunity to be in community with Race Forward is at Facing Race, November 12th through November 14th in Raleigh, North Carolina. This year's theme, Rooted in Resistance, Powered by Solidarity, reflects a convening design to support action that is personal, collective, and transformative. Lastly, a big thank you to you, the listener. Whether this is the first episode you've listened to or you've been with the podcast since 2019, stay tuned. Season 6 is coming soon, and we have so much more to bring you in our collective fight for a just, multiracial democracy. Until then, together, let's keep the momentum going.